Before we get into this video, I wanted to let you guys know that it's sponsored by CuriosityStream. I love CuriosityStream because for under $3 a month, you get unlimited access to educational documentary series. And if you have a kid in quarantine right now who's looking for a way to be educated and also entertained, I would definitely suggest to parents that you get a subscription to CuriosityStream. Also, right now, CuriosityStream has partnered with Nebula, which has given some of my favorite creators like Lindsay Ellis, H-Bomber Guy, and PhilosophyTube free reign to create the educational content that they've always wanted to create that they can't quite create on YouTube. If you sign up for CuriosityStream right now by going to curiositystream.com/katblaque and putting in the code katblaque, you not only will get free access to CuriosityStream for 30 days, you'll also get free access to Nebula. Supporting CuriosityStream helps independent creators like myself and some of the people that you love create the content that they really want to create. So hopefully you guys will check that out. And now we can get into this video. In 1989, the New Warriors first appeared in issue 411 of The Mighty Thor. They were a group of young heroes that were supposed to speak to the teenage culture of the time. Now in 2020, there's a group of new warriors that are being trained by the original cast that are also supposed to speak to today's teenagers. Written by Daniel Kibblesmith, there are 5 characters that are supposed to speak to contemporary teen culture, just as their predecessors did. There's Screen Time, a meme-obsessed teenager whose brain was permanently connected to the internet after he was exposed to internet gas. Trailblazer, a foster kid who has a backpack that apparently leads to alternative dimensions. And B Negative, a goth kid. But the 2 characters that have everyone talking are the psychic twins named Safespace and Snowflake. Safespace is described as a typical jock who has the ability to create pink force fields that are only effective when they're being used to protect others. And Snowflake is Marvel's first openly non-binary character who has the ability to create shurikens made of ice. Combined, their powers are supposed to complement each other. Kibblesmith claimed that the twins chose these names because they wanted to reclaim words that were thrown at them. And you know, I gotta say, I've consulted the muses, and I think we all agree that this ain't it, Chief. This ain't it. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Kathryn, you're a Black transgender woman. This is the sort of character that you should love. I mean, after all, isn't this the representation that you're asking for? And you know what? No, we didn't ask for this. I don't think anyone did. When I first saw these characters, I honestly thought that someone was trolling. I mean, they seem like something that like some right-wing comic book would have, right? But when I looked up who created these characters, Daniel Kibblesmith is a 4-time Emmy-nominated writer, and Luciano Vecchio is an openly queer man who clearly has a good understanding of LGBT representation and history. So where exactly did they miss the mark? Some of you know that I'm actually an illustrator who has a degree in character animation, so I figured that I would actually try my hand at redesigning these characters and dissecting exactly what I think is wrong with them. Now, first things first, while this video is mostly going to be focusing on Snowflake and Safespace, I wanted to make it clear that I think all of these characters are bad. You know, I love the idea of, these characters that represent today's generation. I think that's amazing. But honestly, looking at these characters, it kind of feels like Kibblesmith is just like out of touch with what the kids are into these days. Especially because he seems to think that people these days still use terms like Snowflake and Safespace. But on the subject of their name, let's talk about the name. Let's talk about why these names don't work. Because Kibblesmith isn't a Black trans person, what I think you might struggle to understand is that when you're Black and trans, regardless of how you actually may feel, regardless of what your actual political alignment may actually be, you're always going to be regarded as inherently radical. Now, as a trans person who openly speaks about being Black and transgender on the internet, this may shock you, but I've been called a snowflake in desperate need of a safe space quite a bit in my life, right? But the thing is that those things don't ever really offend me, because I know that there are things that are said to me just to get me to shut up. And also, most of the times when people use terms like safe space, they don't even really know what they're talking about. A safe space isn't like this metaphorical place that I withdraw into when I don't want to have tough conversations. It's a physical place like, a sober home or a women's shelter, or even more relevant, an LGBT center, right? That's what a safe space is. So it's hard for me to really be offended by a lot of this stuff when it seems like they just don't really know what they're talking about. To be totally honest, I really can't remember a time where I've been called a snowflake by someone who wasn't just some angry white dude on the internet. And if I were sitting down and trying to think of a cool word that I could use as my superhero name, I don't think I would even start to consider Snowflake or Safe Space, because that would be overstating the importance of those people in my life. And you know what? I did a little research, I did a little investigation. It really does seem like Kibblesmith is the kind of person who does use these terms, ironically, all the time. And these aren't like offensive jokes or whatever, but I'm just pointing out the fact that he does use these terms, ironically, all the time. Now, I could be totally wrong about this, but my impression is that when Kibblesmith was designing these characters, he had a lot of ideas about what these characters are supposed to look like and who these characters are, but he was pulling from his imagination and not some observation of how Black teenagers navigate through their gender in 2020. Which brings me to my next general criticism of these characters. These characters are not created for my gaze, right? There are characters that are, I believe, created for a well-meaning liberal to read about and feel like they're actually getting some sort of information about the realities of a Black, trans, and queer person. But the reality is like I said, these characters are based on Kibblesmith's approximation of who Black, trans, and queer people are. So ultimately, people reading these books in hopes of learning something are really only getting a very, very watered down version of who Black, trans, and queer people actually are. And to be honest, because of that, I don't really think it's representation at all. These characters don't feel like they were designed with the input of people like myself who live with both Blackness and transness. Interestingly enough, Luciana Vecchio is actually one of the lead artists on Ironheart, which is the comic book about Tony Stark's young Black female protege. When I look at Riri Williams as a character, now we're not going to talk about whether or not it's a good story or whether or not she on her own is a great character overall. We're not here to talk about that. But when I look at her, I identify with her. And it's clear that Black girls all around the world looked at Riri Williams and felt that there was a part of her in everyone, right? And I think part of the reason for that is because Riri is based on real people. She's inspired by Brian Michael Bendis's real Black children, right? And so I think because of that, there's a layer of realism that allows these characters to feel like they are based in reality. When you're Black and trans, you're going to feel ostracized by even the communities that are supposed to be for you. You're going to feel racism from the larger LGBT community, and you're going to feel transphobia from your Black family members or your Black extended community. So part of being Black and trans is finding your own unique way of celebrating both your Blackness and your transness. So that being said, when I'm redesigning these characters, my goal is going to be to make them feel like they're more rooted in realism and make them feel more familiar to me as a Black transgender person. Now, before we get into the redesign, I want to make two things really, really clear. First of all, this book has not been published yet. We don't know the story. We don't know exactly who these characters are. All we're going off of is a character design sheet and some character descriptions, right? Also, I am not non-binary. I'm a binary identified trans woman, and those are my experiences. And as we redesign these characters, I'm going to be pulling from my experiences, but also some of the experiences of my friends who are non-binary. Now, while I don't like these characters, I want to maintain what I think is integrity of these characters, right? I don't want to change them super drastically. I'm going to work within their character description. I'm going to keep their colors the same, and I'm not going to change their name. So we're going to start with redesigning Snowflake, and I wanted to start with them because I feel like that's the one that people are mostly upset with, and I think that in the way that Snowflake factors into the story, they're likely going to play more of a leading role than Safe Space. At least that's what I'm imagining. So let's start. When I'm designing a character, I really like to start with a sketch of their face because it helps me understand what sort of character they're supposed to be. Now, I think one of the first things we should establish when we're designing a non-binary character is that there is not one way to look non-binary, right? People who are non-binary have a really large array of ways of expressing their gender, right? And I think one of the reasons why this design feels so trite is because it's so obvious. You know, the person who is designated male at birth is wearing pink, and the person who is designated female at birth is wearing blue. It's just kind of obvious, and I'm sure that that felt really subversive in the design process. But I think the thing that is fairly universal for non-binary people is that they feel less beholden to, you know, a lot of the conventions that a lot of other people have around gender. So colors are just colors, you know? But oftentimes when a DFEB person is expressing their gender in a non-binary way, it's true that they might want to lean towards a more typically masculine presentation as a way of breaking away from the gender that they were raised to express from birth. Snowflake is still very much in the early phases of figuring themselves out, but they've never been more sure of anything in their life than their non-binary identity. Now in 2020, kids have these supercomputers in their pockets, right? And that means that they are way smarter and way more, you know, outspoken than I was when I was in high school. And as I'm drawing Snowflake, I'm imagining that they are a really outspoken person, maybe the sort of person who is maybe a little too outspoken, maybe in a way that's off-putting to other people. I'm imagining that they are an activist for many, many causes. And I kind of imagine Snowflake as being kind of a serious person, you know, a person who really does take themselves very, very seriously and kind of has a hard time showing that they, you know, have fun or that they enjoy themselves, right? So they have a lot of things about themselves that they don't really like to share at school. In fact, they don't really like school. They love to learn, but they don't like school. That's the kind of person that I'm imagining Snowflake to be. One of the first things I noticed about these redesigns was their hair, right? Now, their hair looks like my hair in high school, right? When I used to chemically straighten my hair, and it was dry and it was a hot ass mess because I was deep in the sunken place, right? But in 2020, natural is in. Having your own natural hair is in, and especially being a Black person, especially being somebody who is very socially aware, I imagine that Snowflake is going to rock their natural hair, right? So I wanted to give them a hairstyle that feels, you know, modern and contemporary and is a little edgy. So I gave them this lock hairstyle that I've seen a lot of Black men wear. It's a very like sort of Killmonger-esque hairstyle, and I love it because I think that it is kind of androgynous and cool, and it's very, very now. So that's the hairstyle we're going with. And we're gonna keep it blue, of course, or maybe turquoise. You guys know turquoise is my favorite color, so yeah, we're gonna keep it blue. Now we're gonna redesign Snowflake's costume. And I kind of do like in the original design how they're wearing basically the same outfit, but in my imagination, these are two very different characters. So I wanted to give them both their own sort of designs, their own sort of outfits, right? So when thinking about Snowflake's power, right? Snowflake can generate shurikens out of ice, right? And when I started thinking about shurikens, I started thinking about ninjas. And when I started thinking about ninjas, I started getting the sneaky suspicion that Snowflake is a disgusting, dirty weeaboo who loves Naruto. You know, the kind of kid that used to, you know, do the Naruto run through hallways at school, but you know, that was middle school, so we don't talk about that anymore. They're the sort of kid who watches subs, not dubs, you know, that's who they are. And so I wanted to give Snowflake a sort of ninja-esque Mortal Kombat Naruto inspired outfit. And of course, they cosplay. Snowflake cosplays, and of course they made this outfit themselves, right? Snowflake is a sophomore in high school, and they're really on the fence about starting T, but one of the things they really do know about themselves is that they really hate being read as a woman. So when they dress, they think less about fashion and more about ways that they can dress themselves to make themselves feel less dysphoric. They're very insecure about how small they are. So in my headcanon, Snowflake binds. They bind because they, again, feel really uncomfortable with people looking at them and reading them as female. And I think that what I love about this sort of ninja costume is that it in so many ways is very genderless, right? A lot of times you'll look at a ninja and you'll assume, oh, that's a guy, right? But when you really think about it, a ninja costume is very sort of, it is really genderless. It's actually supposed to subvert the appearance of the person wearing it. And I think that that's going to be really attractive to somebody who is non-binary and doesn't really want to draw a lot of attention to their body. Now, disclaimer, of course, not all non-binary people feel that way. A lot of non-binary people are very much about, you know, having their body be a thing that people look at and people celebrate. But in my vision of Snowflake is the sort of non-binary person who really just feels uncomfortable with people looking at their body and making assumptions about who they are. All right, now we're gonna move on to Safespace. And I want Safespace's design to be similar to Snowflake's design, but different enough. Like I said, I want them to be, you know, still look like twins, still look like they could be related, but I also want them to be their own unique characters. So much like with Snowflake, we're gonna start with sketching his face so that we can kind of start to figure out what kind of character he is. So as far as we know, Safespace is not non-binary, but he is a guy who likes to wear the color pink, right? And he's also described as Kibblesmith as being a sort of typical jock character. So when I start thinking about those sort of ideas around the character, especially with the fact that his power is to generate these shields that are only really able to protect him if he's also protecting another person, I started thinking about our current ideas around masculinity and how in 2020 it's really common for men to do this thing where they'll wear something that is typically considered to be very feminine, and because they're so confident in their masculinity, it doesn't contradict it, right? And when I think about this, I think about, you know, these sort of sexy K-pop guys like Kai from EXO, especially in the Obsession music video. He wore this kind of like sexy, kind of midriff showing kind of crop top situation with a blazer. It was a really cool kind of look, but he still very much seemed masculine and sexy. And so when I'm imagining Safespace as a character, I'm imagining him as being that kind of guy who can wear that sort of shit and is still seen as like a really sexy, cool guy, right? I imagine that Safespace is a sophomore. I mean, of course he is, because you know, his sibling is as well, and they're twins. But he's way more popular than Snowflake, right? While Snowflake really cares a lot about labels and is all about them and seems to be all about them, Safespace is just the kind of person who doesn't really identify with them, right? He's a sort of guy where, because of the way that he dresses and the way that he expresses himself, people always think he's gay. And whenever they ask him if he's gay, he always just says, you know, I don't really believe in labels. You know, he's that kind of guy. And then he'll go on to date like the hottest girl in school, right? He's a Black man who's very, very aware of a lot of the pressures that he's facing being a Black man to upload these sort of typical masculine ideas, right? But he just doesn't care, right? He's the kind of guy who you can look at from afar and you assume that he's probably a bit of a jerk, right? Because he's like good looking and confident. But when you talk to him, you realize that he's actually a really nice guy. But at the same time, you also realize that he's kind of in his own world a little bit. He's kind of, you know, in his own, sorry, I'm getting so excited about this character that I dropped my pen. He's kind of in his own world, right? And because he's always sort of in his own world, he's a little selfish. He's a little selfish, right? He is protective of other people and defensive of other people, but he's mostly doing that as like this sort of performance that makes him look good, you know? He's the sort of person who, when Snowflake gets misgendered, he's all about calling people out and saying that they shouldn't do that. And he makes a really, really big deal about it when they're in public. But privately, he also kind of, you know, feels like Snowflake is a little bit, you know, too sensitive and thinks that, you know, they don't really need to be as worried about these things or as upset about these things as they are, right? I'm gonna give him the same hairstyle I gave Snowflake, but I'm gonna make it a little longer and I'm gonna add some lock jewels just to make it a little bit more extra, because that's the kind of guy he is. He takes every opportunity to stunt for the gram. So when it comes to Safespace's costume, I want to give him something that is hard, but also soft, right? I really just enjoy that dichotomy. So I'm going to give him a pinkish purplish wax boiled suit of armor. And I'm going to make the midriff exposed because, you know, the EXO reference, because I have to, absolutely have to. I'm also going to give him this sort of kilt, sort of leather armor situation that kind of, again, looks like a kilt, because I also think that that's kind of an iconic sort of look that for some men feels like they're very, you know, it's one of those things that's very masculine in, you know, Scottish culture, but seems feminine to people who are outside of that culture, right? And I'm also gonna make sure that the hardware on his leather armor matches his lock jewels, because of course, that he just has to. He has to have that extra, the extra little bit, you know, that extra little bit, you know? And I'm also gonna give him the same sort of boots that Snowflake has. Well, I'm gonna adjust them a little bit so that they look like they're more appropriate for his outfit, but they're gonna be a very similar boot, right? So Snowflake kind of had this Batwing sort of design going with the whole ninja outfit. So what I'm gonna actually do is I'm going to sort of mimic that shape by giving him a shield that goes on his back. And that is gonna kind of make it so that they have very similar silhouettes, even though they're very distinctly different characters. And that's how I would redesign Snowflake and Safespace. Now, I'm not the best artist. This is just the first draft, but I'm really curious to know what you guys think about my redesign of these characters. When I look at these two characters, they feel familiar to me in a way that when I look at Kibblesmith and Vecchio's designs, I just don't feel, right? I feel like these could be real people, and I feel like they have a lot of markers that would reflect the reality of what being a Black, you know, person navigating through gender in 2020 would be. Of course, they have these sort of nerdy outfits, but that's also very much a reflection of kids in 2020 who are falling deeper and deeper into nerd culture, and D&D is coming back, and you know, it's just, I think that my designs are just a little bit more relatable to me, right? Here's the thing, I really do want to see more Black, trans, and non-binary characters in comic books. I really, really do. I think representation is incredibly important. But when the most interesting thing about your character is that they're non-binary or that they have a sexuality outside of heterosexuality, I don't really think that's good enough. That's really not what we're asking for. You know, I obviously support diversity in comic books and in video games and in all media, but I don't really want to do it unless you're going to do it correctly and with the proper consideration, right? I believe that these characters in their original design were created to simply pander to people like me, but a character being non-binary does not save an uninspiring character design. We deserve badass characters that are created with us in mind and not created to pander to us. If you want to create characters like us, a good first step is to talk to us, to get us to look at what you're doing. But an even better step would be to actually hire us, right? When it comes to comic book representation, I want to fall in love first with a really solid character that's really badass and really cool, so cool that I start to think about who they are outside of this. Who are they when they're not trying to keep the city safe, you know? I want to be able to then fall in love with this non-binary nerd who puts their life on the line to defend not only what they believe in, but often to defend people who don't believe that their gender is even valid, right? Because that's a very real part of being Black and trans in this world. Being able to accept that there are always going to be people who will never see you as valid and continuing to fight on. Anyways, I would love to hear what you guys have to say about my redesign. If you guys like it, if you guys feel connected to it, especially if you're a Black, trans, or non-binary person, I definitely would like to hear from you. And yeah, let me know what you guys think about this whole situation. I can't believe that this is real. I can't believe that this is actually a comic book that's going to come out. Like I said, it's not out yet. I think it comes out on the 20th of April. I might be wrong about that. But yeah, I was flabbergasted when I found out that this was real. So I'm really curious what you guys have to say about this. Marvel is getting a lot of flack for this release and a couple other releases that they've had, especially in a time where the virus is making it so that a lot of comic book shops can't you know, stay open anymore, which is really, really, really unfortunate. So yeah, I want to know what you guys have to say about all of this stuff. And you guys know that I read all the comments, so I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. I think I've said that like 5 times now. I guess that's my cue to go. Anyways, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, I hope you will. And you know, my Patreon followers saw this video before everyone else. And if you're interested in that, join me on Patreon. You help me do videos just like this. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.